Hi, this is Sean Wildermuth. Welcome back to Coding Shorts. It's been a while. I haven't been able to record these for a couple of months, and if you've seen these videos before, you're probably used to seeing a much nicer setup. I have a very rickety gorilla setup going on right now, and the big reason for that is that I've moved. I've left Atlanta and I'm now living in the Netherlands. And most of our stuff and most of my equipment is in a customs warehouse right now. It might be there for another month. But I'm committed to getting back and getting these videos done for you. I'll have a number of videos coming out, hopefully one per week starting now, though the video is going to look kind of like this. Bad lighting, bad studio. We're just in a temporary apartment right now, so we're going to have to all put up with it. I did want to mention, if you are in the EU or in the EU time zone, I am having a architecture workshop coming up on February 24th. You can see a link on the screen that'll take you to all the information. It'll also be down in the show notes. Today I want to talk about Entity Framework tooling. Now, I've talked about Entity Framework in a number of different ways, but starting in .NET 8 and then extending into .NET 9, there's some new features of the tooling itself, not just the runtime, that I think a lot of people have missed, or at least I missed, so we can see how many people are ahead of me on the curve on this. Let's look at some of these new features next. So I'm in a pretty simple project. I've got some data, it's returning some APIs, very, very simple, and it's a API project. In fact, I have a little tester here. These are the two APIs that I'm testing right now. All is good, right? The problem is that I have these entities, a flight and a passenger, and I've created some migrations for them, but I don't know where I'm at with those migrations. I'm just gonna go ahead and open up a terminal. Let me make it a little bigger. What I wanna do here is use the .NET EF tooling. And if I look at the version I'm working with the 901, though many of these different facilities will work on 8. Because the tools aren't versioned with the runtime, you can actually use the tools on older projects as well. That's one of the first things we can do here, which has been new to me, is use has pending model changes. This is where we can ask the project whether there's new schema changes that haven't made it into a migration yet. And if I do it now, we'll see no changes have been made to the model. But if we go ahead and come in here and add a quick property, and I'll just erase this later, let's just add a quick bool here that says, is flight on time? And I'm going to say false because we all know what happens with airlines. So I'm going to default it to false. If we go back to the PowerShell and we run that has pending model changes, again, we're doing this on EF migrations, you can see it's showing there's new changes that have been made since the last migration. You can go ahead and add a new migration. I'm going to undo that because that's not really a change. And we can see that with that gone, then says we don't. And so it's a nice little tool that has helped me figure out whether I need a new migration or not. Next, let's look at EF database update. This is a command that we've all probably used before. This will take all those migrations and apply them directly to the database that is specified in our app settings file, right? In my case, just a local database. So we know that this will update our project's database to the latest number of migrations that are in there, or if you're not using migrations, to what is actually in the project. But there's another command here called db context, and we can tell it to script the whole db context into a SQL statement. This will take a look at a db context, and you can specify which one. I only have one in this project, so I don't need to specify it. And tell it, go ahead and create a script for us. There's our script. We can now see the flights and passengers are created, and because I have data in them, it's actually doing the entire process of upgrading our project. And so this is an important idea that you may not want to run your project with the Entity Framework on production code. You may want to be able to just hand scripts to individual people in IT or other people that are responsible, or even in your deployment scripts. This works as well in migrations. So let's go ahead and list our migrations out here. So it only shows one, and it only shows that is pending. And so if we said .NET EF migrations script update.sql, I'm going to replace the other one. This will be a little different because this will actually be the changes, not of the context of the actual migration. Very similar to what it was doing before, but you'll notice has the EF migration history table that is created the context is just going to create a script for the database in general. Now that's interesting, but that's obviously all the migration. So one of the other things we can do here when we are creating migration script, we can actually add a -i as a parameter, and that will create an idempotent script. That script will be the same every time it runs. That essentially will guarantee that the different parts are going to be controlled from which migration is put in. And you'll also see that passengers get their IDs specified instead of just taking the next values. This just makes it that every time you run this, you'll get a database that's exactly the same. So let's do one thing more that I think is interesting. Let's go ahead and say .NET EF database update. So I'm going to update the database with the migrations as they sit right now. It applied the migration, but what if as we continue on our project, let's say we're in a v11 or a v20, we do need to add some other property here, something that we don't necessarily have to do, and we'll go ahead and create a new migration for that. So .NET EF migrations, add nickname. Just as a easy migration, we'll go ahead and add it. And you'll see here that we now have 2 migrations in here. If we come back here and say .NET EF migrations list, we'll see that we have 2. And we'll even notice that the second one is pending. It hasn't been applied yet. We can see the different migrations. And if we go ahead and say .NET EF migrations script, we can tell what the migration we want to start from. This is a little unobvious, though. We want to, even though we have the initial schema, we want to say this is the base for our script. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to put it in here and say, like I did before, output update.sql, and I'll make it idempotent. Now our update will only include the changes in that individual migration. You'll see here we're doing an alter table to add our nickname. We're updating the version of the migration ID, making sure we don't have it, update them all to set it to null, etc. And we go down here. This is just going to include that. And so that's kind of interesting. We can now create scripts for what we want to do every single level. Then we can create a migration step that goes from 1.0 to 1.1. And that makes things a lot easier to manage so that you have scripts that you can run during the upgrade process instead of hoping that the migrations are going to do exactly what you want. Go ahead and go back to our shell one more time. In that same way is we could actually go ahead and say .NET EF migrations bundle. So we'll go ahead and build our project and then create what they're calling a bundle. And a bundle is going to be an executable that will run the scripts for migrations. And this is really interesting because this is just a piece of executable you can include in your deployment script so that someone or even your startup could run this. Instead of having to have all the tooling, this is simply just EF bundle. And you can rename this as well. And there it applied that migration because it went in and looked at the application to see what level the database was already at and apply that migration. And so if you don't want to actually have to take those scripts and put them together, you can use the bundle to sort of simplify that whole process. Pass it on to your IT folks or your Azure or AWS folks as when you start up an instance, you're going to need to run this. Now this does require the app settings that has the connection strings in it, but of course the app settings don't need to be there. They could certainly use any of the ways you're getting data into app settings. So environment variables for production is pretty common, or Azure Key Vault, or however you're getting those. So enough about applying migrations. Let's talk about one more piece that I think is really fascinating. So you can tell from this, I have a pretty small data project. And so this is going to load up when EF starts pretty quickly. It's going to read them in and it's going to build that data model in memory for us. But when we start to use larger and larger contexts, and I know for many of you that you're like, you should never use larger and larger contexts. And while that's true, I agree with that, that's not always possible, especially when you're dealing with legacy projects that you're trying to bring up into .NET Core. So if you're having startup speed issues, this could be that the web server is starting slow, or if you're using it in a desktop application that startup is slow, we can actually improve that with a new command called .NET EF DB context optimize. Essentially, you want to give it an output directory in your project and I'll call this optimized, to create code that will build the model in memory when EF starts up much, much more quickly, because we're essentially pre-compiling all the native work it would have to do to figure out that model. And so if I run this, you'll see I get a new optimized folder. Again, you could call this whatever you want, but these are the different pieces about the type. Assembly attribute's the interesting one, because this one essentially just tells it the DB context model, look at the flight context as the type it wants to do on, again, it's assembly in this project, and then go look at the flight context model for it to build up that model in memory instead of doing the way it normally would do it, which is at runtime. And so the context model is creating these runtime models that EF uses internally to figure out what your model looks like. And so it'll have a lot of things you might not be that surprised with, or maybe this is where it'll have annotations and foreign keys and the different entity types that it wants to use. Again, this isn't user editable code. This is auto-generated, but it's to help speed up large models. So for the most part, if you need to do this, you'll want to run this command, DB context optimize, and it'll build these, though you're going to need to regenerate it every time the schema changes. It's not going to magically do that. This is really an optimization for cases where you're concerned about speed. Make sense? So hopefully I've shown you some tooling that you might not have been used to, or it's opened up some facilities that you've probably been manually doing. I've spent time with different clients that were manually building these SQL scripts, not relying on migrations, and that's a perfectly fine way to go. But if you want to leverage the way migrations work, but not get out of your SQL file deployment strategy, this is a good way to sort of do that. Or if you want to be able to hand something for them to execute, to update the database out of the bounds of running, let's say, a web server in Azure. This gives you a lot of that opportunity. And of course, if you're working with large models, if you're working with large contexts with 20, 30, 100 different tables, using Optimize can really help you speed up startup speed. Again, I'll just give you a quick plug for my architecture workshop. You can see more about it at the link in the show notes and here on the bottom of the screen. And thanks for your patience for waiting on me for 2 months to create a new video, but I'm back. And if you have any sort of topics you want me to cover, go ahead and add them as comments to this video. I have a list that I'm going through, and I'd love to add any ideas that you guys have that is really important that isn't a full course. Remember, coding shorts, the shorts should be underlined. These are meant to be 10, 15 minutes at the longest, so I can't teach in-depth things with it, but I can get you started or get you familiar with different ideas or questions you have. It's been Sean Wildermuth for Coding Shorts. Thanks for joining me.